I'm at the Play Pie and a Pint rehearsal rooms today with Mike Gonzalez. Mike and I have collaborated in theatre in a number of ways in the past, but most recently we've worked together on putting together and bringing to the stage the season of plays from Latin America at Oramore at lunchtime. Mike, it's nice to have you here and nice to talk about it.
It certainly has been a lovely experience, hasn't it?
Well, it's all happened so quickly.
I know from the what is it, from the conception to the realisation anyway, it's been just what, a few months?
Yes.
Really. But I think we were lucky enough to have access to a range of plays, and it was obviously the moment, you touched the moment and it was right. And it's been very exciting. It's been very exciting from the point of finding the plays, to the point of sitting down with the adapters and talking through what inevitably was not. I wasn't there to give lessons in theatre, but to talk a little bit about this other reality, which has, I hope, opened up for them and for the audiences, and given a little bit of a sense of the contact with Latin America, both its difference and its similarities to what. I mean, there's the first play about a worker, finally exploding in a factory situation, which is very much about the experience of workers in Venezuela, where the play is from, and yet, especially now, incredibly identifiable for so many people who are facing as well the same pressures at work, the same kind of cranking screws, the same fear of losing their jobs.
Yes.
So it was a good connection because it was the way it was done. I felt it still felt like something that was happening in another play.
Yes.
And yet it was immediately, it connected very directly with the people who were there.
It's certainly one of the things that give me the most satisfaction about the season. If I had a worry, it was, would the audiences engage with these plays in the same way that they engage with plays by local writers or writers from Europe? And it's been very obvious that they have engaged with them. People have drawn all kinds of parallels, particularly they've talked about events in North Africa, they've talked about the student protest movement. There was even a number of people who saw the Confidant who said it put them in mind of the Sheridans.
Oh dear. Oh, well, never mind.
It's interesting that people very often try and find experiences of their own that relate to the work they're seeing.
Well, that's exactly how it should be, isn't it? I mean, theatre should produce and stimulate your own memories. But I think what interested me, for example, the one that was perhaps most demanding, and yet everybody has spoken to me fantastically highly of it, were the plays from Argentina, and particularly the monologue called Instructions for a Butterfly Collector, which is the story, the monologue, the autobiographical story of one of the people who have become involved in this extraordinary movement around the disappeared.
In Argentina, Buenos Aires,
in Buenos Aires mainly, though everywhere else. These were people who it's a generation who grow up thinking that they were the children of one family, who then discovered, as the truth about the dirty war and the military dictatorship began to emerge, that in fact they were the children of parents who had been murdered by the previous regimes, and they'd then been farmed out, mostly among families of officers in the army and the armed forces and the police. And the shock and the horror of finding that you're 18, 19 years old and then realising that everything you know about your life is a fiction was tremendously dramatic and tremendously horrifying. There's something more powerfully appalling about that. One remove, I mean, the murder of people is terrible, torture is terrible, but to blight a second generation in that way is just dreadful. And the monologue, brief though it was, brilliantly played as it was, really got to people. And I think that was another aspect of Latin American experience that was opened up through that play.
But what was at the heart of that monologue was a terrific piece of storytelling, and storytelling is international.
Acabsolutely, of course. Of course, because you are drawn almost instantly. Good storytelling says, "Come into my world, be with me, accompany me as I go through this journey, and I travel through all this stuff again." Of course, it was absolutely electrifying.
The other thing that surprised me a bit was that with some of the plays, like A Dead Man's Dying, it's an inherently funny situation, and you knew that in the hands of as good an adapter as young Davy Anderson, it was going to be funny. But I was very surprised by the amount of humour that some of the other adapters drew out of the work, which wasn't quite so obvious. And in the Confidant, in the opening performance, the audience were laughing a lot about this chap who comes home with too much to drink and apparently tried to regenerate his sex life. Yeah. And it hadn't been something that struck me when I read it, or indeed even when I saw it in rehearsal. But the audience were one or two steps ahead of us, and although it becomes a very dark piece, it had within it, like all the works to a degree,
they all had
a degree of humour.
I mean, humour as a weapon, as a piece of armour against the dark. You know, when things are dreadful and appalling, it's quite common for people to discover humour as a weapon. Humour as a form of resistance.
Yes.
And once you see humour as a form of resistance, on the one hand, as it is, for example, the humour of the dead man's dying.
Yes.
You know, is the dark humour of people who finally see their moment come and lived under the oppressive heel of this landowner who's a swine for all these years, self-deluded, ridiculous, but terribly violent and brutal. And suddenly the tables turn. And the humour is in the fact that he doesn't realise until too late. He believes he's fooled the peasants, whereas the peasants know better than he does what life is really about.
Yes, yes.
And the Confidant too, it's this bombast, isn't it? It's this, arrogant confidence that, I am what I am, and nobody's going to get me now.
Yes.
And then suddenly his world disintegrates in front of him. And he deserves it. He deserves it, at worst.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of the adapter, because in this season you've had a lot of different functions, but the two main functions you've had in one case has been the translator of all the plays, but you've also been the adapter of Marianella's play. Mm-hmm. So you crossed that divide, and I'm interested to know what you think about it.
I'm not sure if I describe myself as an adapter. In the process of doing Marianella's play, has been fascinating because it has been a process, it has been a collective process. I mean, now it comes from a tradition of collective creation where people got together with very powerful and charismatic directors very often, but always the process of the play was a process of collective creation. And I have to say, sitting watching the process of this play with Paddy and the actors, it seemed to me very much like a process of collective creation. So there are stages. One is a translation, which is more, it's not just a literal machine translation, it's more than that. I mean, you take this world, the act of translation is an act of reproducing an experience in its equivalent world somewhere else. It isn't just linguistic, it's cultural.
Yes.
Then after that, there's a second phase, which is the phase of, if you like, the act of communication itself, the theatrical act itself, the aesthetics of it. And that's adaptation, I think, to make it a piece of drama, something much more than the information contained within it, something much more than the structure of the word, something lived. And the adapter, and I have to stand back and say, the adapters were young playwrights. If I was an adapter, I think I was probably less centrally involved than the others were, because both the director here, Paddy, and the group have brought to bear on this quite complex world of culture, their own understandings and their own responses to culture. To culture itself, to popular culture, to music, to the soap opera and so on, to melodrama. And that's been fascinating. So adaptation is really about, making sense of melodrama, making sense of what you know about this world, but then genuinely integrating it into your universe and media, your universe and media.
Looking to the future, Mike, I think it's been interesting to do this, to take two or more audiences an experience of theatre from another part of the world. Do you think that has a role, a function in part of our programming?
Well, I think about this on two levels. One is, I think it absolutely has a function. Oran Moore has had plays from elsewhere from the very beginning, and I think that, you'll forgive me for saying this, but I think if there is a danger at all, it is a danger of insularity. There's a danger in making familiar theatre with an audience. I think one of the things I admire about Aaron Moore is that every time it seemed to me there was a danger of there becoming a house style, it got broken, and I suspect deliberately so. You know, and something else emerged.
Well, I mean, I think that has been very much part of my thinking, that I've always felt with theatre, as soon as you begin to feel you know what you're going to get, you don't want to go. Because the great thing about theatre is that it challenges you, and that it makes you think in ways that you're not used to thinking, both in content and in form.
I mean, if you think about it, you know, what's the main influences on cultural thinking, theatre as well as other things in the recent years, has encouraged the idea that there is a kind of uniformity, there's a sameness in the experience that people live across the world, and we are becoming more and more, as it were, standardised as a world. Well, if anything's blown that out of the water in the last few years, it's been the experience of Latin America, which has forced itself into the vision of people around the world by its eruptions, by its resistance, by its revolutions, by its challenges. And
but that was very much part of my thinking. I mean, I felt if we're going to look at, and here I must thank Vicky Fellowson from the National Theatre of Scotland for saying, let's look at world theatre. That was her idea. And my response to look at Latin America was very much because I thought here's a part of the world that is not sliding effortlessly into the free market. It's perhaps the same way that is happening in China and India, although I'm sure we find lots of contradictions there. But it did seem to me that was one part of the world where very, very fundamental questions were being asked.
Absolutely.
And also a part of the world where we knew that the novel and the cinema had had a profound effect on Western cinema making and novel writing. And I felt convinced, and you were the person who convinced me that the theatre was similarly interesting.
But I think, and so now, I mean, what that says is that, you know, of course, global capitalism imposes a degree of some kind of uniformity, the uniformity of the market and so on. But what's interesting is at the same time, everywhere there is resistance, and the resistance has its roots both in the shared experience, but in the specificity, the particularity of people's lives, backgrounds and cultures. That's why, I mean, independently of my association with it, that's why I think the SOPA is an important work, because it says people, as it were, have imaginary universes which aren't so easily invaded and burnt down and destroyed as their houses and their libraries.
Yes.
You know, they can carry that with them, it's in their minds, in their hearts, and they will reproduce and use that as a place in which they can relive, reenact both their own past and also act out possible futures. And I'm absolutely certain that given the events of the last 3 months, I'm absolutely certain without a shadow of doubt that this very process is going on in the Middle East now. I saw the Palestine National Theatre a few years ago, and it was such powerful theatre, such daring, avant-garde theatre as presentation, as theatre.
Yes.
Its ideas were embodied in theatre, in dance, in theatrical enactments, which were wonderfully powerful. And I'm quite sure that just as they did in Latin America, they found in theatre the instrument of representing a different and better world. They were doing it in the Middle East now for certain sure.
Yes. And well, it's interesting, you know, when you talk about the world of the imagination that is less easy to destroy, less easy to attack, less easy to burn down. It's interesting that when events like events that happened in Egypt happen, they are always immensely imaginative as well as practical. You know, the way in which people respond is almost like that world of the imagination has come to the forefront, and what was the day before such an oppressive force that you couldn't contemplate opposing it suddenly seems no longer like that.
It's the extraordinary things. It's the extraordinary thing, you know, that overnight those structures that have imprisoned people for decades suddenly melt away. I mean, Lenin described revolution as the festival of the oppressed, you know, and storming heaven was the other phrase they used. And suddenly you looked at Tahrir Square, and you saw, like, all the barriers are breaking down. There are women in hijab, on the security posts around the square. They're staying overnight in the middle of the square with thousands of other people.
Yeah.
There are Christians and Muslims linking arms to protect the mosques.
Yeah.
You know, there are, I mean, and suddenly all those barriers which seem impenetrable, rigid and eternal, melt away in a second.
Yeah.
And that tells us, and that, if you like, is the greatest act of theatre of all, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, that you create a different world in the place and the time. But
Yeah.
insofar as theatre is an anticipation of that, you know, and hopefully the world will impose upon theatre again that should be its role. And it doesn't mean politics in the sense of pedagogy. It doesn't mean people coming out and giving lectures in a costume.
Yeah.
It means something else. It means activating this incredible imaginative possibility. That's what revolution is.
Well, I think that certainly that's one of the things that I've drawn some pleasure from this season of plays is the sheer variety of approaches to making political theatre. When I first started working in 784, we were very conscious of the form as much as we were content. When we did the Chief of the Stag and the Black Oil, we took the Cayley. We didn't just sort of take a political message and batter people with it. We took the fiddle and the accordion, we took the song, we took the people who were standing up and telling stories and telling jokes. And when we did the next play about John McClane, The Games of Bogey, we looked at the whole sort of variety tradition and tried to create a variety show. And what's been very interesting about these plays from Latin America is the richness and variety of form, as well as the content of the pieces.
And that's why, all these years later, I remember the Chibi at the Stag like it was yesterday, and the Games of Bogey as well. They're absolutely locked in my memory, they're re-evoked by 100 different stimuli. It remains with me, as I'm sure it does with the whole generation.
So where do we turn to next? Are we going to look at the Islamic world? Are we going to do this time next year another season?
Absolutely, of course. I mean, what I've seen of it says to me it will be as imaginative, as stimulating, as exhilarating, as unexpected, as demanding, as discomforting, as this, in some ways, this theatre has been too. And you know, and that way we can, and as the world shifts and changes, you know, more and more can shift and change with it.
Well, I think perhaps that's a very good point for me to thank Mike. Mike made a huge contribution with Nella, with Nella Llanos, the author of the Sopar. They made a much greater contribution than that play because between them they helped us to find almost all of the plays and many others indeed that we haven't been able to produce. And Oran Moore and I think its audiences owe a great debt of gratitude to Mike and to Nella. Thank you, Mike.
It's a great pleasure.